So, looks like we are live. So, hi, good evening.
Good evening.
To Toronto and to Ottawa. All of my friends are in Ottawa tonight. I'm Metta Spencer, and I'm here with three friends who are going to tell us about reforming the United Nations. And maybe it needs its time, you know, it's been what, 70 years? Is that right? About that. And it's time for some changes to be made in the way we run this world. So we're going to hear something about that. But in the meantime, before we get started, I want to tell you why we're doing this. And that is that this is a series of talks that I've been putting together as kind of preparation for people who want to attend or be involved with a process that I call How to Save the World in a Hurry. And that is an effort to find public policy proposals that are capable of reducing various kinds of global threats. I mean, big whoppers of threats, you know, like nuclear war or famine or cyber attacks or global warming, those things that could wipe out 1 billion people at a whack. And so that's what we've been working on, looking at public policies that may be pretty visionary, maybe even utopian, but that if they were adopted would do a lot to reduce the risk of these, one or another of these dangers. And we know that these dangers are interconnected. They have some causal relationship with each other. They form a system. And when you have a system that you're dealing with, means all parts of it interact and have effects on other parts. That makes it easier in a way to resolve problems, because if you work on one part of the thing, you know you're helping to solve the problems, the others. And we have 6 different global threats that we're trying to solve now: war and weapons, especially nuclear, global warming, famine, pandemics, major radiation exposure and things like a reactor explosion, and cyber threats. But in order to make those things happen, we have to do some other things to change structures in the world about how we finance things, how we govern the world, how we give security to nations so that they can afford to get rid of their own armies, and how we create greater equality, because certainly the trend has been toward greater and greater inequality, which we have to work on. So those are the things that we're dealing with. And as of day after tomorrow, this event will take place at the University of Toronto. It's a forum. It'll be 2 full days at the University of Toronto. That's May 30th and 31st. And we will be picking 25 proposals that we're going to put together on one platform, one piece of paper, called it the Platform for Survival. That's what I've been doing the last 6 or 8 months. And I see that some of our people here have been doing other things, like writing books about the United Nations. So I want to turn to that now, after I have invited you all to check it out. See if you want to come to this forum. There's seats available, I'm pretty sure. And you could get in. The admission is like $120 for a normal person who's well-to-do. And if you're broke, we'll let you in for $50 or so. Or if you're a student or something. Anyway, so check it out. The website is called tosavetheworld.ca. And it's, I think you'll find some of the proposals there. We're going to sort of weed out the silly ones, or the ones that we can do without, that are not too much to the point, and pick the really most useful ones. 25 proposals for public policy changes that will change the world when we get there. So if you feel daring and bold and willing to work hard, because this isn't a regular conference. This is not like people giving papers. This is a conference where you have to work. All right. If you want to do that, then please get in touch with us, and you would love to have you come. Now, let me start off by asking my friends here to say a bit about themselves. My first speaker is John Trent, who has a new book. Tell us about yourself and your book, John.
Well, Metta, first of all, congratulations on your initiative. That's very strong thing to do. And for myself, I'm a former professor a retired professor from the University of Ottawa in political studies. And I've been an author. I should say I was also the executive secretary of the International Political Science Association for 12 years. And then I went on to help found the Academic Council on the United Nations System. So that's for my career. And the book that I have just written with Laura Schnurr, this is a copy of it. I don't know whether it's readable on the machine, but at any rate, it's a book that does three things. It tells you what international organizations are and how to understand them. And it gives you an introduction to the institution of the United Nations. And then it concludes with 9 different types of reform that have been drawn from the literature on the United Nations. And then it winds up with about how it's necessary to create a social movement like what Metta is doing in order to get people off their butts and move towards the reform.
Oh, good. All right. Thank you, John. We'll want the details pretty soon. Let's go now to Robin Collins.
I've been involved in peace disarmament studies areas for some time. I'm with the World Federalist Movement Canada, as the other two are, and also with the Group of 78 and the Canadian Pugwash group. So my focus in the disarmament area has been on conventional weapons, nuclear weapons, also interest in UN Emergency Peace Service and Sustainable Common Security, as well as the responsibility to protect doctrine.
All very important things for us to come back to in a bit. And now we have the guy who's the head honcho in the World Federalist Movement in Canada, Fergus Watt.
Well, thank you, Metta. I'm more the company bureaucrat rather than the head honcho. I'm based in Ottawa at the national office of the Canadian section of the World Federalist Movement, which is an organization dedicated to applying the principles of democratic federalism to international affairs in order that global governance becomes more democratically accountable and effective. And lately, I've been running or providing secretariat support and coordination for a project that involves some international NGO partners called UN 2020. What we're doing is endeavoring to interest member states and civil society partners at the UN in a 75th anniversary for the UN, which will take place in 2020. The UN was founded in 1945, and what we're trying to do is create momentum for a 2020 event that will include a process of stock taking and renewal and reform for the organization. So it's necessary to get that started now. And I'm happy to say that we've had a little bit of success with this. Many small and medium-sized governments are responding favorably, and just in the last few weeks, some text that would mandate a 2020 process has made its way into a resolution of the General Assembly. So we're getting there. It hasn't been passed yet, but at least it's in a draft. And so this is a kind of an inch-by-inch campaigning effort that we're running at the UN.
That is very interesting. It seems to me when you were first talking about this 2020 thing, it sounded like a conspiratorial group that in a back room doing some secret stuff that might turn out to be interesting if you got a permission to bring it out in daylight. But it sounds as if now maybe you are able to expose it to our scrutiny a little later in the show.
Sure.
Great. Okay. Why don't we start though with John's new book, because that's always a good way to get us going. Tell us about that book, and some of the reforms that you. Were you saying that that you're referring to the kinds of reforms that have already been tried, or the kinds of reforms that you think need to be tried, John?
These are ones that need to be tried that have there've never really been many serious reforms in the United Nations. It's under continuous reform for administrative and financial activities, but not for real structural change. But I'd like to go back to the question you asked us just before, where you said, why do we need to reform the United Nations? And there are two reasons for that. The first is, if you take humanity, we started off, all of us, in little tribal groups around the world, and we then arrived at the creation of federations that span the continents. Excuse me, my voice is not very good tonight. And so the time has come now where all the major problems of the world, you've mentioned some of them already, but just take climate change and plastic straws in the oceans. Someone has to make decisions about this. Well, one decision is just being made by the European Union, but we need decisions for the world. And these can only come from a world organization. We think the shortest path to that is through United Nations reform. The second reason is this. A lot of people may not recognize this, but right now we are under we being people who are interested in global international cooperation, we are under attack by a whole bunch of nationalists, neo-nationalists, and populists. Trump would spring to mind, but there are many others. These are all people that want to wreck and bring down all the constructive efforts that have been made to create the means for international cooperation. Let me just add there, look, people don't think about it, but the reality is that the world runs pretty damn well all the time now. And it runs well because of the international organizations that we're all members of. And if anything happens to them, we're going to be in dire straits. So those are the two main reasons for looking for change and reform at the United Nations. And the second one, I should say the thing that I'm going to start off with, because we have a sort of a 9 or 10 types of reforms in our book, which was written by Laura Schnurr. I think she's already been on with you, and I. And so these ideas for reform are not a sort of plan. Now, we're not trying to say, this is what we have to do. What we're trying to do is introduce people to the biggest problems and ways they're solving them that have been written about now for several decades by specialists in the United Nations. The first one I'm going to talk about is the funding of the United Nations. And the problem is there that every country should pay a fair portion of fees. That is not the case right now. What happens is there's a big mishmash of fees and voluntary contributions that are given. And they run from the United States paying for 25% of the United Nations all by itself to other countries who are at something like 0.1 or 0.1 of the thing. So there are, at present time, there are about, I think it's 40 countries that pay only 4% of the UN budget. So so the system is unclear. It's made up of obligatory contributions and voluntary ones. And it is completely all divided up. Now, Professor Joseph Schwartzberg, in his book, A Transforming the United Nations System, proposes that the most direct route to change is to abandon this complex system, have fees and voluntary contributions, and replace them with a small, affordable, and equal national assessment based on a percentage, say 1%, 0.1%, of the respective gross national products of countries. He calculates that in 2010, this would have raised $58 billion, which is double what is being spent on the United Nations system at the present time. So that is the first, I think, really wise, intelligent, and doable system. And then the second is, and a lot of people have heard of these, there's all sorts of ideas out there for the independent financial resources for the United Nations. These include levies on air and sea travel, production from global commons, the transnational movements of currencies, and each of these could be taxed at a tiny proportion that would not harm or hurt anyone and would raise all the money that is needed for the United Nations. Now, final statement is that why is this not being done? And the reason is, and this is a very sad perspective, and it's something that I hope you'll take up at your conference, is that the governments of this world do not want the United Nations to be more independent and powerful. They want to have all the power themselves and make all the decisions, even though all our problems now go outside of national boundaries. But they still are like Trump, and they saying, America greatest and first. And we have to move beyond that. And the one technique is finding a way towards funding for an international organization.
Bless you. All right. I think that's great. Now, we'll come back to some of your other reports, your other reforms in a bit. Let me think now. I think I want to skip over and talk to Fergus about this 2020 business before I come to you, Robin. Is that okay? Fergus, tell us about it. What have you guys been doing in that back room?
Well, we've just been having a lot of meetings. The idea of a 2020 summit was first proposed in a blue ribbon panel co-chaired by Madeleine Albright, the former U.S. Secretary of State, and Ibrahim Gambari, who's a former foreign minister in Nigeria and Under Secretary General at the UN. They co-chaired a panel of experts that made a great many suggestions on reform. And it was the Commission on Global Security, Justice, and Governance was the name of their report. And this idea of pointing toward a date in the future and mobilizing states around it was one of their recommendations. And we started last year, early in the year 2017, talking to governments about it. And that was at a time when there was a new Secretary General, and there was also a new president in the United States who was known to want to cut here and there at the UN, as many some U.S. Republican administrations have done in the past, and governments that we met with were nervous and as John noted, there is a widespread trend toward nationalism and populism that is mitigating against the kind of international cooperation that we want to deepen at the United Nations. But what we found is that that there are a lot of small and medium-sized governments at the UN that want the UN to succeed, that want it to be strengthened, and don't like what they're hearing from some of the big powers, and they're quite happy to work with us. And this is one of the what I would say is the successful strategies for how reform has been achieved in the past. If we look at some of the campaigns that have done well in recent history, and recall, for example, the International Criminal Court or the Landmines Treaty, or most recently the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, the formula is similar in that it's an alliance of civil society organizations and small and medium power states working through the General Assembly of the United Nations to bring about either a treaty or some other institutional reform. And so this is the kind of the playbook that we have in mind for 2020. Hopefully that there will be a process initiated that will lead to dialogue in capitals around the world and regionally and among experts in civil society, and a range of proposals, and then a kind of a coming together and winnowing of those proposals as we get closer to 2020. It's also it's a process that we're probably familiar with if we followed the evolution of the Sustainable Development Goals, which were one of the UN's really big successes, and were adopted in 2015 after a really large global dialogue. I don't think that the reform of the UN or strengthening of the UN is going to match the SDGs in terms of effort and engagement. Reform is still some sort of the purview of nerds and experts, and you just don't have the kind of buy-in that you would have on something as broadly based and where there's widespread interest in something like sustainable development. But nevertheless, we're aiming towards consultations leading to a range of proposals, and then hopefully a document, an outcome document in 2020. We don't, as the sponsoring organizations for this project include the International World Federalist Movement, something called the Workable World Trust, Civicus, which is a large international NGO focused on civic space and other human rights, and the Stimson Center in Washington, which was also one of the co-sponsoring institutes for this global commission that I mentioned earlier. So we, as a small coordinating group, don't really. It's not that we don't have ideas. We have many. There's lots of good ideas out there, but we're focused primarily on getting a process started for this, and then once we get some mandating language, and then comes the time to talk substance. So there isn't a sort of a UN 2020 project party line on what we do about the Human Rights Council or the Security Council or the General Assembly or any other UN body. There's a plethora of ideas about where this could go, but the probability is that it will not include charter reform, opening up the UN Charter, and that's probably just as well, considering all of the problems that come with that. I could go into that later if you wish, but
kind of disappoint me. I kind of think I was going to hear that you really have some revolutionary ideas there, but it sounds like you've got the process going. Sounds like a very democratic process, but that you are going to let the others decide what it is, what the goals are going to be. I mean, surely in your in your inner soul, you must have some preferences about what aspects of the UN you would like to see changed most urgently. And I wonder if you want to go public with that inner quest. I wouldn't mind saying that I would like to see a parliamentary assembly. Now, you're going to say that's ridiculous. That can't be done. But go ahead, then tell us what you think could be done.
I mean, a parliamentary assembly is a reasonable prospect, I would say. What we end up, we often get pushed to talk substance when we'd rather talk process, just because that's tactically how we're engaging the project and moving things forward. But what we did at the website for UN 2020, we've listed some principles and that we're pursuing. So we want to act in a manner that's consistent with some of the Secretary General's existing reforms. We want a people-centered UN, and that's a broad phrase that would include things like the Parliamentary Assembly. Another variant on the proposal for a Parliamentary Assembly is a parliamentary network, but one that would be rooted in a decision of the General Assembly, so that it would allow some states to send parliamentarians and therefore have a legitimate democratic link to citizen representatives. But in states that do not have elections, there would still be the possibility for representation through other means. So this is a variant. So there's different ways that one would go about considering and creating a body of citizen representatives next to the UN or General Assembly, so that over time the UN becomes a more democratic institution. The best way to explain the Parliamentary Assembly proposal is to look at the example of Europe. When Europe was formed in the Treaty of Rome in the early 1950s, they created a Parliamentary Assembly at that time, and it was composed of parliamentarians from national parliaments on loan to the new European institutions, and it evolved. Parliamentarians being parliamentarians, they want to develop their own capacities and authority, and so they were the one. The interesting thing is that the Parliamentary Assembly itself becomes an engine of reform. It's the European parliamentarians that pushed hardest and earliest for many of the evolutionary steps that have led the European Union to be what it is today, which is a quasi-regional government. Really, it's not quite a full-fledged government, but there's decision making on many important aspects of the life of European citizens taking place at a regional level, thanks to the growth of the European Union. And as it's done that, it has led to peace in Europe, which had eluded Europeans earlier in the last century, and democratization and a greater level of social cohesion. So integration is a desirable goal, and creating a body of citizen representatives can be a kind of a lever, something that moves the agenda forward, and it's like a built-in driver of reform. So that's one of its advantages, and when pushed, when the time comes, I think there will be lots of people advocating for strengthening, not just creating a parliamentary assembly, but strengthening the role that civil society plays at the UN.
Metta, if I may.
Let me ask you though, Fergus, because I like to start with a problem. What problem would you say the UN has structurally now that's the most serious, that needs to be fixed? I mean, you've given a good process, but it doesn't give me a very good idea of what is going to get fixed as a result of this process. What's the matter? What is there that has to be, that we should be worried about?
Well, I'd like to just go back to something you said a little earlier, and what Fergus is saying about the process for reform is really, really important. It's one of the trickiest things in international politics. If you can look at the two little rocket men at the present time and see how they're juxting about where will they meet, how will they meet, when will they meet, will they meet, won't they meet?
Yeah.
You know, and this is gone all throughout history. They used to argue about the size of the room, the size of the table, the dimensions, and all of this. The reason is that people don't want to be misled. And so the trickiest thing of all is that in this process, there are a lot of things I would like to see happen. But if any one of these things can put off the big players, for instance, and they turn hands down on the process, then it just comes to a screaming halt. And that's why a gradualist approach, like our friend Fergus is undertaking, is not only the best, but necessary.
Maybe I can put in a couple of comments on, let's say, reform of Security Council and General Assembly. So, you know, what many people immediately think about is, you know, the veto, the problem of the veto. Let's eliminate the veto, right? So this is one of the ones that John's talking about, where if you eliminate, or he tried to eliminate the veto, of course, the veto members would block the elimination of the veto. But also you could disrupt everything because the P5 were antagonistic. So let me offer two suggestions that are in circulation. One is, and I think a very significant one, I think we touched on it, I think, last week a little bit, which is that in the case of an atrocity crime, so a very severe crisis globally, it could be an atrocity crime, but for which the Security Council is divided in opinion. Is it possible that there could be development of a consensus within the P5 or within the Security Council more broadly, that those states that were not implicated in the particular atrocity would abstain in the vote and not veto? So that's a case where you have reform in sort of process without threatening the structure. And it might be doable. I mean, I think it's Fergus and John could probably talk more specifically about, you know, whether they've seen progress on that front. But another one is this is one that Joe Schwartzberg has proposed, I think, about 15 years ago, which is weighted voting. In other words, to elevate the influence of the General Assembly. So one of the problems that you can quickly come to with, you know, let's let a majority within the General Assembly make all the decisions because, you know, they're more representative. In fact, if you took the smallest states and combined them, you might have 130 states, which would give you, you know, the 2/3 vote, but they would only have 8% of the actual world's population within those 2/3 of states. And similarly, if you had, you know, the denial of a resolution from the security from the General Assembly that would, you know, you would need 1/3 of the states, let's say, that you know, 1/3 of the states plus one would be able to deny a resolution going through the General Assembly. And if you had all the smallest states in agreement, that could be 1% of the world's population. So what was proposed was if the General Assembly was to have more influence on these areas where it would be permitted to do so, it would be a combination of, let's say, 2/3 of the states, member states of the UN, and as well, at least half the population of the UN would have to be covered by those states, and a factor of contributions to the financial contribution to the UN would be another factor. So if you created a rubric within which those factors were in play, then there would be a more democratic argument for the General Assembly, competing with the Security Council, let's say. So those are two kind of processes.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah, and just further to what Robin was suggesting about voluntary constraints on the veto, there is a coalition of governments at the UN, and there are now, I think, 122 of them that have signed a code of conduct, so that when they're on the Security Council, they will not vote against a reasonable measure to halt atrocity crimes when they're being committed, and of course this increases the pressure on the permanent members to act responsibly and perform their international obligations to maintain international peace and security. And there's a similar initiative put forward by France and Mexico for voluntary restraints on the veto. And it's interesting, primarily because France has a veto. And so they're actually saying that they will act in this way to limit the use of the veto in the instance of atrocity crimes against humanity, war crimes, genocide. But this is, I would suggest that this is a small example of a larger, I think, a trend in UN politics, which is that the General Assembly is underappreciated and is in fact taking on more and more responsibilities, particularly now that there is so much dysfunction and lack of agreement among the major powers in the Security Council. So you're seeing, for example, on Syria, the General Assembly, faced with the failure of the Security Council to do its job in Syria, calling emergency debates under the Uniting for Peace resolution, and now they were only able to get agreement on an independent investigative mechanism for crimes in war crimes in Syria. They weren't able to mobilize. You're not going to get a General Assembly intervention, coercive measures in terms of sanctions or armed force, but it's a start. It's a step towards the General Assembly taking on greater authority. I think it's Article 39 of the Charter that creates the Security Council, that says the General Assembly confers upon the Security Council the responsibility to maintain peace and security. And here you're seeing the General Assembly taking back that authority when the Council is unable to act. One thing I like to remind listeners about the UN is the importance of the General Assembly. Much of the best that has come out of the UN has been General Assembly processes. And while we can talk about and Robin is quite right to point to the problems, the lack of democratic legitimacy of the one nation, one vote system, It's nevertheless true that it is the most democratic body in the UN, and all of the world conferences, the Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Climate Agreement, they were in 2015 two recent big successes that were General Assembly processes. So there is, and when the General Assembly acts by consensus, then its decisions can be effectuated, and so it's often an underestimated body, particularly by Western governments, including our own, who think that the Security Council is where the action is, and but it's at the General Assembly where so much good work gets done.
Mm-hmm. That you said something that fascinated me, but about the notion that the General Assembly confers rights on the Security Council. Are you saying that they could reverse that, and they can say we're going to take more of it back, or we're going to change the rules for you guys? What are the limits to what the General Assembly could do vis-a-vis the Security Council's strength? Could they actually say we want to, for example, could they change the veto?
Well, there is in the Charter of the United Nations an article that allows for the change and reform of the structures of the United Nations, and so this would have to be all the members deciding together that they want some change. Now, getting them to agree on particular changes, or getting them to agree to take away powers from the Security Council, and so on. All these powers are very delicately balanced when they set up the UN, and that's why it's something. It will happen at some point, but we say the General Assembly. It's not the General Assembly. It's all the member states. They could easily decide to have a different balance of powers within the United Nations.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Metta, there's a process called the Intergovernmental Negotiations, and that is the General Assembly led discussions of reform of the Security Council, and it's mainly focused on representation on the Security Council. In other words, not its functions and powers. And it's been in existence since the end of the Cold War, when people thought that the UN would that this was now a time for the UN to work as it was intended to work. But what has happened is that these negotiations have gone on for since I think 1993 or 94, there are some states that make a claim that they should be legitimate permanent members of the Security Council. Germany, Brazil, Japan, and India, and the G4 proposals that include usually two African states, but Africa can't agree on which two. This is the most common formulation. There's dozens of different proposals, and almost every one of them has opposition, regional opposition. So Argentina opposes Brazil, and Italy and other European states oppose Germany, and Pakistan opposes India, and so on. And this is just and then there's variations in terms of what kind of a seat on the, permanent with a veto, permanent without a veto, semi-permanent, in other words, longer 6-year elected terms. There's all kinds of variations, but fundamentally they're talking about representation, how big the council should be, to make it more representative than a body whose permanent members reflect the victors in the last World War. And while that seems, eminently reasonable, it's also insufficient, because what we need is the Security Council system is based on the maintenance of peace and security through enforcement by the Council. And so the Charter gives the Council binding powers. Security Council resolutions are binding on member states, and the Council can institute diplomatic measures or other coercive measures, including sanctions, up to and including the use of military force. So the question should be asked, would the world be a better place if we simply changed the representation on the Council to have these, instead of these 5 permanent members, to have 11 or 10, or and create regional little hegemons? Arguably that would not be the best way to move toward a more peaceful, rules-based order. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done in terms of our conception of security. Lloyd Axworthy, when Canada was last a member of the Security Council, recognized this and advocated a human security agenda. Robin spoke earlier about sustainable common security. So, abstract, as woolly and kind of abstract as it sounds, ideas about sustainable common security and ways you might make the maintenance of peace and security less militarized and more based on the rule of law are also very, very important. And this is where the potential of the International Criminal Court comes in. It makes much more sense when the peace has been breached and there's massive crimes going on against civilians or war crimes. It makes much more sense to bring the people in authority, the people who have command authority, to justice, rather than punishing a whole state, which is what you get in the state-based UN system. So there's lots of ways that we could think about approaching peace and security through the functions and powers of the Council, not just representation on the Council.
Okay, I'm glad you mentioned this, referred to human security and common security, because I think it'd be worth comparing those two concepts. Robin, when you talk of common security, sustainable common security, is that the same thing as what Axworthy was talking about when he was mentioning human security?
They're certainly related. There's a whole number of these securities, and I'm not going to outline them all, but let's just say the Axworthy initiative on human security was to shift from nation state security, that is sovereign borders, protection of the state, to protection of population, citizens within the states. And so, if you look at R2P, that was kind of part of that shift as well. Responsibility of states to protect their citizens. It's not just to protect their borders against other states. So sustainable common security is kind of a new idea that we're developing. And it's kind of a combination of common security, which is, came out of the 70s, where the idea that states were interdependent and we were mutually vulnerable. Therefore, we should work together on global goals and cooperatively and so on. And sustainable security comes out of the Oxford Research Group, with the idea that you need to look at long-term scale, look at underlying problems to sustain security. So the UN now talks about sustaining security. That's another one. Sustaining security, which is incorporated within. Let me put this another way. they combine within sustainable security. They combine sustaining security, that is longer term security, with the sustainable SDGs, development goals, and so you can see that the overlap there. But when we talk about UN reform, if I can just go back a little bit out, we're talking about progressive reform of the UN. The UN is, as John mentioned at the top, is under attack, from isolationists and anti-cosmopolitans, and it's also even under attack.
Bolton. I mean, imagine him being Secretary of State.
Well, so that worst case, right? But it's also under attack from idealists who see the UN as corrupted because it's an organ of the Security Council, which is an organ of the US, and there's sort of this diving deep into its worst nightmare. So when we talk about reform of the UN, we're talking about getting civil society and nation states and members of the UN to improve the UN, to develop it, to build it, to finance it properly, so that the common security elements that were really at the core of the UN, and the core of common security is UN focus. We need to build this up, and so I think civil society has a big contribution to make in getting their head around this, because if the UN is not at the center of development of global norms and human rights and peace and development and governance, then, as Fergus says, what will be? Will it be regional groups? Will it be major powers or whatever? So the reforms we're talking about are critical, and we're fighting from behind a bit right now, because there is a significant assault on the UN and what it does that's good, and so we want to continue the good and to improve on it by building it up.
Mm-hmm. Let me throw in a completely wild card. I suppose you don't really like nation states, so you want to have governance of people as they are, wherever they are. And I don't think people now are all that much identified with yes, some people are, that's the danger. But I, for example, I don't know what country I'm living in half the time. And more of my friends are living all over the world than in my city. I just, so my identity, and I think that of a lot of people, transcend national borders or even citizenship in particular nation states. And yet the United Nations is a body of nations, not of ways of representing individuals and their interests or concerns. But when I want my interests or concerns to be represented, it is generally by joining some sort of organization. It might be my church, or it might be active in the Red Cross, or it might be Greenpeace or something. It might be something about global warming. It might be, there are any number of things that actually represent my concerns a lot more than things that can be described in terms of political boundaries and constituencies and so on. And I like the idea of having more and more influence of international NGOs, because that's how I'm actually represented. The people who represent me in Ottawa, I don't even know who they are half the time. And my city councilor, I don't know who that is. I could go find out if I want to, but it isn't relevant. But, every day I read emails from organizations that I belong to, Pugwash, or, organizations that are global in scope and that really are dealing with the issues that are important to me. Now, I like the idea of having a world, place where the UN people should come to the UN and be representing their voluntary organizations, organizations that people join because these are outfits that represent their concerns. And that's different from the notion of empowering nations and jiggering and fiddling with the voting system so as to make it more representative. Now, okay, I just waded into something that I shouldn't have done, but I give you the chance to tell me why I'm all wet. Go for it.
Metta, the answer, of course, comes back not to international politics, but to national politics. We start off within our own societies, and we all have interest groups that we're members of. We all think we put more of our effort and time into those groups than into our political parties. There's very few people that are members of political parties in terms of population. But the point is that at any given time, when you have a body, and it can be a territory or it can be something other than a territory, but you eventually have to have someone who can decide. You have to have someone that can make decisions. And so the solution to that is not to have some sort of disintegration, if you will, of society. Everyone agrees with you that we all know where our proper interests are and how we try to make them work, just as we're discussing tonight. That's part of our efforts to make good of the opinions and that we want to put forth. But sometimes the whole idea of Western democracy is that you have to coagulate these interests together through various steps of representative institutions until you can get some group that is able to legitimately, we hope legitimately, say that they represent the greater good of all. And so it's not simple at all. But the thing is, with the United Nations right now, we've got this situation where we have something that's quite good, that has worked quite well. And we now know that we have to take 3 steps to reform it, to change it. The first step is to get people to admit that the United Nations is helpful and useful, that it's a good thing. The second thing is to have ideas, as we're discussing tonight, about specific reforms. And the third thing, and this is where Fergus is working now, is building a world movement. And you're helpfully doing that to get people to be inspired about how to get world reform, because we probably won't get it from the state governments. What we've got to get it from the people telling the governments what we want them to do.
When you mentioned human security, I mean, one of the elements of human security was not transparency so much, but getting civil society involved in development of new norms and treaties and so on. If you look at, since the end of the Cold War, look at all of the initiatives that have come about, from the ICC to child soldiers to the landmine treaty, the cluster munitions, the new nuclear weapons treaty, to be a whole list of them that I've just started in on. Almost all of these have involved a significant amount of civil society involvement. So even though, generally we work in our civil society groups within our own nation states, and depending on how democratic those states are, we have more or less influence, and depending on the government of the day, we have more or less influence. But one of the reforms that we see almost always mentioned when we're talking with UN institutions is the heightened involvement of civil society, even in the meeting rooms. Sometimes they're on the side rooms, but sometimes they're even sitting at the table to be involved in the discussions, because it affords legitimacy to the governments that bring them in and to the institutions. So, so we are talking about at the international level of civil society. It's actually happening, and on the national scale, it's happening particularly in democratic states.
Thank you. I like that idea. And Fergus, now you can take that and do something with it in your 2020.
Well, right? I'm glad you raised that, Metta, because I think it is the case that more and more people around the world are thinking just as you are in terms of living a more global, cosmopolitan life these days. And we are stuck with a nation-state system in which international authority is vested. If you want to get anything done, it's governments that have the legal authority to do it. But what Robin just said in terms of the growing influence of civil society is an example of how we're endeavoring to overcome that outdated, framework where global governance requires the bargains and agreements among nation states, and so it's a multi-stakeholder process now that brings together some of the other players, cities, for example, and different authorities and stakeholders are shaping global governance now, and so our institutions just have to catch up with our global consciousness.
The problem.
All right, thank you. Oh, you want to say something more, John?
Yeah, I was just going to say that the problem is, Metta, that even good things come up against walls. And all of us who are trying so hard to work in international non-governmental organizations, we have now created fear within the governments of the world, and they are trying to stop international non-governmental organizations and to slow them down, to slow down their funding, to delegitimize them. And so that it's always, politics is a back and forth situation.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so we have things to look forward to. This 2020 thing, when you guys actually decide to come out and tell us what you're really going to do, I want to hear what it is. You got to come back, Fergus, as soon as you get to the substantive, the decisions that people are actually going to choose to be the reforms they want to enact. I want to hear about it.
If I can just, sorry to interrupt, Metta, if I can just say that there is if John gets to plug his book, I'll mention quickly that there is a UN 2020 website, and at that website there is a civil society call to action that we're hoping people will support.
Perfect. Good. We all get to plug something. Robin, what would you like to plug?
The shift to common security and sustainable peace document has been updated by 9 major NGOs across Canada, and that will be released at your forum in Toronto at the end of this week.
So we can plug the same thing. Everybody has to come to Toronto. Not the end of this week. It's 2 days. It's day after tomorrow that we start. So you better hurry and go to the website and sign up, because it's going to start without you if you don't hurry up, folks. And the website is tosavetheworld.ca. And there's even a place where you can click and sign up for it. This has been fun. And I learned something. Isn't that wonderful? Okay, I appreciate this. And I don't know what we're going to do next week. I've forgotten. But I think it might be basic income. I tried that a few weeks ago, and we had some technological glitches, which were entirely my own fault. And so it failed. But I think we might resurrect that discussion again and make it another try. I appreciate very much your contributions to this. It's been good for everybody and good for the world. So what we're going to save in 2 days. If you want to come save the world, you're welcome. All right. Thanks, guys.
Bye, Metta.
Bye.
All right.